In Texas, Blaine Milam became the fifth person executed in 2025. Nationwide, his death brought America's execution total to 33 for the year. But this wasn't just another death row statistic. This was the end of a 17-year nightmare that began with the most horrific crime scene investigators had ever witnessed. A 13-month-old baby girl, tortured to death by the very people meant to protect her, all in the name of casting out a demon. What you're about to hear is the disturbing true story of an exorcism that was really murder, a case that would challenge everything we thought we knew about forensic evidence, and a crime so brutal that seasoned detectives still can't forget what they saw that December night in 2008. December 2008. The small town of Tatum, Texas. Population barely 1,300 people. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where the biggest news is usually who won Friday night's football game. But on one cold December night, that peaceful existence was shattered forever. At 18 years old, Blaine Milam was living in a trailer home with his teenage fiancée, Jessica Carson, and her 13-month-old daughter, Amora Bain Carson. To the outside world, they looked like any other young family trying to make it work. They had no idea they were about to witness evil in its purest form. The 911 call came in during the early hours. A baby was hurt. She needed help immediately. But when first responders arrived at that trailer, what they found would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The paramedics who responded that night had seen plenty in their careers. Car accidents, overdoses, domestic violence calls. But nothing, and I mean nothing, had prepared them for what they found inside that trailer. Little Amora Carson wasn't just injured. She had been systematically tortured. The 13-month-old's tiny body told a story of unimaginable cruelty. Human bite marks covered her skin, dozens of them. Her skull was fractured in multiple places. Both arms were broken. Both legs were broken. Multiple ribs were shattered. But that wasn't all. Investigators would later discover she had been strangled, beaten with a hammer, and subjected to the kind of prolonged torture that would make hardened detectives question their faith in humanity. The injuries were so extensive that medical examiners couldn't even determine which one actually killed her. Any of several could have been fatal. Rusk County officials, some with decades of experience in law enforcement, would later say it was the worst crime scene they had ever encountered. Think about that for a moment. In a career filled with humanity's darkest moments, this was the absolute worst. And when investigators questioned Milam and Carson, their story kept changing. First, they said Amora had been injured in an accident. Then they claimed she ate something poisonous. But finally, they revealed what they called the truth. A truth so bizarre it defied belief. They claimed they were performing an exorcism. They said 13-month-old Amora was possessed by a demon, and they were trying to cast it out. An exorcism on a baby who could barely walk. But investigators knew better. This wasn't an exorcism. This was torture. This was murder. And the evidence would prove that Milam and Carson had systematically brutalized this helpless child over an extended period of time. The forensic pathologist who examined Amora's body testified that she had suffered multiple skull fractures, broken arms, legs, and ribs, along with dozens of bite marks covering her tiny body. The violence was so extreme, so prolonged, that it painted a picture of two people who had lost all sense of humanity. But here's what makes this case even more disturbing, if that's even possible. Amora wasn't some random victim. This was her family. Jessica Carson was her mother. Blaine Milam was supposed to be her stepfather. The people who should have protected her, loved her, kept her safe, they were the ones who killed her. Both Milam and Carson were just 18 years old when they committed this unspeakable act. Barely adults themselves, but old enough to know right from wrong. old enough to know that what they were doing to this baby was evil. The investigation revealed that Amora had been tortured over multiple days. This wasn't a moment of rage or a single act of violence. This was sustained, deliberate cruelty. The bite marks alone told the story, dozens of them, inflicted over time, evidence of a systematic campaign of abuse against someone who couldn't fight back, couldn't run away, couldn't even speak to tell someone what was happening to her. When the case went to trial in 2010, the courtroom was packed. The community of Tatum and the surrounding area wanted to see justice for little Amora. The trial had to be moved from Rusk County to Montgomery County due to the intense media coverage and public outrage. The evidence against Milam was overwhelming. Beyond the physical evidence on Amora's body, prosecutors revealed that Milam had confessed details of the crime to a jail nurse after his arrest. He had also attempted to hide evidence, showing consciousness of guilt. But the defense had a different story. They claimed it was actually Jessica Carson, the mother, who had killed Amora. They painted Milam as someone who was manipulated by Carson, who was reportedly suffering from psychotic delusions that her child was possessed. The jury didn't buy it. On May 17, 2010, they found Blaine Milam guilty of capital murder. After a separate punishment hearing, the judge sentenced him to death by lethal injection. Jessica Carson was tried separately and also convicted of capital murder for her role in her daughter's death. However, she received a sentence of life in prison without parole rather than the death penalty. This disparity would later become a point of controversy in Milam's appeals. For the next 15 years, Milam would sit on death row while his attorneys filed appeal after appeal, searching for any legal avenue to save his life. And they found some compelling arguments. The first major issue was the forensic evidence used to convict him. Milam's conviction had relied heavily on bite mark analysis, a forensic technique that experts have since determined is highly unreliable. In fact, a 2016 Texas Forensic Science Commission report deemed bite mark analysis essentially junk science. Think about that. A man was sentenced to death based partly on evidence that we now know is scientifically worthless. This wasn't just Milam's problem. It was a systemic issue affecting potentially hundreds of cases across the country. Milam's attorneys also argued that he was intellectually disabled, which would make him legally ineligible for execution under Supreme Court precedent. They pointed to his low IQ scores and questioned his adaptive functioning. Additionally, they highlighted that Milam was under the influence of methamphetamine during the crime and argued that he lacked the specific intent required for capital murder. These arguments led to multiple delays in Milam's execution. His first scheduled execution date was January 15, 2019, but the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals granted a stay on January 14, just one day before he was set to die. This was during a period when Texas was re-examining convictions obtained with unreliable scientific evidence under a 2013 junk science law. A second execution date was set for early 2021, but this too was postponed when courts issued another stay to further examine the lingering questions about Milam's mental capacity and the bite mark evidence. But ultimately, the courts ruled against Milam on all fronts. They determined that he did not meet the legal criteria for intellectual disability, finding that his IQ and adaptive functioning did not exempt him from the death penalty. They also ruled that even without the disputed bite mark testimony, there was ample evidence of his guilt. The courts noted that beyond the physical evidence, Milam had confessed details of the crime to a jail nurse and had attempted to hide incriminating evidence. The overwhelming nature of the evidence against him, they concluded, made the questionable bite mark analysis irrelevant to the overall conviction. as 2025 progressed, it became clear that Milam's legal options were running out. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles unanimously denied clemency 2 days before his scheduled execution, declining to commute his sentence to life in prison. On the afternoon of September 25, 2025, the U.S. Supreme Court also refused to issue a final stay, clearing the way for the execution to proceed that evening. And so, 17 years after little Amora Carson's brutal murder, Blaine Milam was strapped to a gurney in the Huntsville unit of the Texas State Penitentiary, preparing to pay the ultimate price for his crime. The execution began at 6:19 p.m. when the lethal dose of pentobarbital was administered. Witnesses reported that Milam gasped once and then lost consciousness, quietly snoring before all movement ceased within minutes. He was pronounced dead at 6:40 p.m. at the age of 35. In his final statement, Milam expressed gratitude to those who had supported him and spoke about finding faith in prison. He urged everyone present to accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, and we will meet again, reflecting his belief that he would see them in the afterlife. Notably, Milam did not apologize directly for his crime in his last words, focusing instead on religious consolations and farewells. Among those who witnessed the execution were Rusk County District Attorney Michael Jimerson, who had originally prosecuted the case, and Amora's grandfather, Richard Mudna. After Milam was declared dead, Jimerson spoke to the media, stating, "We will never know what Amora would have contributed to our world." Answering the call for justice for the most helpless is a measure of a civilized people. Amora's grandfather was present, but declined to give a statement to reporters, likely still processing the end of a legal journey that had lasted nearly 2 decades. The execution of Blaine Milam marked the 5th execution carried out by Texas in 2025 and brought the nationwide total to 33 executions for the year. But for those who knew Amora Carson, this wasn't about statistics. This was about justice for a little girl who never had a chance to grow up, to speak her first words, to take her first steps, or to experience any of the joys that should define childhood. The case remains a sobering reminder of humanity's capacity for both evil and justice. It raises difficult questions about forensic evidence, intellectual disability, and the death penalty itself. But at its core, it's a story of Amora Bain Carson, a 13-month-old child whose short life ended in unimaginable horror at the hands of the people who were supposed to love and protect her. The brutal nature of her murder, disguised as a religious ritual, shocked a community and a nation. The legal battles that followed highlighted flaws in our justice system, while ultimately affirming that some crimes are so heinous, so evil, that they demand the ultimate punishment. Today, Blaine Milam is gone, but Amora Carson will never be forgotten. Her memory lives on as a reminder that we must protect the most vulnerable among us, and that when we fail in that sacred duty, justice must and will prevail. This was the exorcism murder, a case that tested the limits of human understanding and the strength of our justice system. In the end, justice was served, but the scars left by this case will remain forever etched in the hearts of all who knew Amora's story.